technology quite often, so I hope that it is going to work. Uh, I was thinking about the panel which we were given, and given what I'm going to talk about, perhaps it could be rephrased uh, putting the confessional constructions of the Bible under question, because some of my comments would be very similar to the first speakers. What do we do when we interpret the scriptures, and what do we experience? This, I think, would be my guiding questions as I explore the contemplative reading of the scriptures in the context of the ecumenical retreats. So I will be referring to the old tradition that goes beyond the main confessional divides. When I will refer to the church fathers, they predate the Western Eastern Christian schism. And then when I refer to the medieval exegesis, that predates the Catholic Protestant schisms. And I think these facts are important for today when some of the recovery of that common heritage takes place. Special attention in my paper will be given also to what is usually called the pre-critical exegetical methods, or perhaps more exactly, we can call them differently critical methods, because it's not that they would not engage with any form of criticism. And I will also ask how they can interact with the modern and the postmodern critical consciousness. The text brings together my interest in hermeneutics and in spirituality, and work with both of these areas through the lenses of my practical experience in taking and accompanying the Ignatian retreats. What we may call an Ignatian intercultural and ecumenical reading of the scriptures is broadly practiced, while it is rarely theoretically reflected upon. Hence, methodologically, I will have to combine engaged research, insights into the tradition of the spiritual exercises of St. Ignatius and its ongoing interpretation, and the parallel work on the critical appropriation of the hermeneutical methods, rehabilitating the importance of the contemplative reading as we find in current Orthodox theology, that applies also to the Ignatian practice. Thus, I will address the following areas: the centrality of the conversation between the creator and the creature, to use St. Ignatius's vocabulary; the attractiveness of the following of Christ when this moves beyond ideological frameworks; the critical use of human imagination and experience; the need for interpersonal conversation, which would include both spiritual direction and sharing with others in the context of the ecumenical retreats. Then also tools for what I would call a multidimensional discernment, which would be both personal and communal or ecclesial, and ways of ecumenical and intercultural translation that allow people to feel at home in traditions that they initially thought could not be their own. And perhaps here I should make just a little comment, because in my understanding, it also includes the scriptures, because we too often forget that what we call the Old Testament is not only our holy book. And if we recognize this more fully, perhaps, it can help us to develop what I would call a non-possessive relationship to the Bible, which could enable the gratitude and openness towards others and their interpretations. And hopefully this can undermine both anti-Judaism and anti-Islamic ideology, just for an example. Oops. So here you have some pictures from the different ecumenical retreats I have experienced for 30 years and I have guided for last 20 years. I will tell you later on how they started very briefly, and here you can see different forms. Some of them would take place in the Catholic monasteries, others in the cottages of people. Some of them would be walking retreats. There would be retreats which would have common introductions, even guided prayer, or individually guided retreats. There has been a great variety. And also we had people on these retreats, not only from different church denominations, but occasionally also from other religions, or people who would not identify themselves with any religion at all. So there was a very strong ongoing process of inculturation, interculturation, and basically translation. Now I would like to introduce to you Father Ludwig Armbruster, a Jesuit of Czech-Austrian origin, who worked for over 40 years as a missionary in Japan. He was the person who actually started the ecumenical retreats I have been part of in our country after the Velvet Revolution. I think what is important to say is that he himself experienced to be expelled from Czechoslovakia in 1950 when all the religious houses were closed down. And because he was partly Austrian, they didn't put him to the labor camp or to prison, but they expelled him from the country. Then he lived, as I said, for over 40 years in Japan. He taught philosophy there, and he worked with local seminarians, which meant that he experienced the process of translation at several levels. Not only translation into Japanese language and culture, but also when he taught Western philosophy, it was another process of translation. And some of his favorite spiritual authors would be the Jesuits who would work in India and who in India would develop very strong interreligious network. And this is something which he could bring to the Czech context. And through these lenses would not interpret theoretically, but guide practically the Ignatian retreats for various groups. Now I would want to make just some comments on Saint Ignatius, his life story and his spiritual exercises. This is important because I think it influenced how the spiritual interpretation of scriptures could be made for and by people from the confessional contexts which carry very heavy baggage from the past and confessional divides. I think, let me just find my page in the printed text. I think when I reflect on that, first the appropriation of St. Ignatius's life led to actually possible different usage of the exegetical methods when it came to the reading of the scriptures. In a strange way, this happened actually the other way around from what one might expect. What was so important and interesting on the life of St. Ignatius for these audiences, where there were many people who came with very strong prejudices that the Jesuits were part of the Inquisition and part of the persecution of the Protestants, and to move from that to actually accept them also as their teachers in the spiritual life and as their teachers in the biblical interpretation was a very big move. And as this move has taken place, it enabled a different mutual exchange. The exchange then went both ways. It was not just a single way. I think what was attractive was the holistic mission and the spiritual vision that can cope with a multicultural and multi-religious context. And I mentioned Father Ludwig Armbruster, who really very strongly emphasized that from the beginning. A way of responding to human suffering in a non-schematized way, something which you can read also through the life of St. Ignatius and which was also read in the context of the post-communist Czechoslovakia with many wounds. a sense for the hidden life of God that is actively at work. Basically, the combination of the divine revelation, divine mystery, and the work with the critical mind. Although there would be tensions, there doesn't have to be animosities. Complementing a critical analysis of the problems of the societies and churches of our time with a contemplation and action growing out of that. This is another Ignatian phrase to how to be contemplative in action. And complicated while necessary relation between a personal and a communal discernment, which would, I think, stress both the different situation of each person, and yet would be, I think, a very strong protection against individualism. His work with life experience and its role in the spiritual interpretation of the Bible was also attractive. So these are just some comments. In the written text, I have done much longer part on the life of St. Ignatius and its various interpretations, but I would not do it now because I need to get to the spiritual interpretation of the scriptures. But I would make perhaps just a couple of comments. Just a couple of comments of what has been important. Through his encounter, through his conversion experience, and then encounter of the Benedictine shrine of Our Lady at Montserrat near Barcelona, St. Ignatius experienced the heritage of the Desert Fathers, and when he gave himself the retreat in Manresa, where he stayed for over a year, he almost killed himself, and he experienced how dangerous it can be when somebody who is enthusiastic but inexperienced guides himself. And this is why he started to appreciate a spiritual direction, not of somebody who makes the discovery on behalf of the others, or tell the other one what to think and what to do, but who would be like a kind guide or even sort of safeguard that would stay at the background. And that would, I think, provide also the connection with the broader tradition of the church. In that context, he moved from following of Christ, which was first an external, immature imitation, to what he would see later as an internal relationship. And this was another stress, which was, I think, of particular importance, especially to the Protestants, but even to the evangelicals, charismatics, or the Pentecostals. What was especially important for them was also the work with the errors. That the fact that you decide with all your heart for following of Christ doesn't mean that you will always get it right, or that you will have a divinely granted knowledge when you read the scripture and your heart burns with the fire of love. You still can be wrong. But what is the role of being wrong differs, and how God can work with us being wrong differs. St. Ignatius paid also much attention to discernment, and this is another aspect which is important for the spiritual interpretation of the scriptures. Discernment in Greek, diakrisis, coming from the verb diakrinein, means to separate out, to make a distinction, to learn by discriminating, to determine, to decide, to give a judgment. And he has been aware that in our spiritual life, there are not only different times and forms of judgment that takes place, but as we mature, we integrate the wisdom from them. But none of them can guarantee us that we could independently of God and independently of God's grace can make right decisions. But we can live with the decisions that we make, and we can live with those decisions in the light of the love of God. But I will move further now. I would want to speak about the spiritual interpretation of the scriptures and about reasons that brought it back into life in the context of the Ignatian retreats. I think one of the very strong emphasis, which we also heard in the first lecture, was treating the scriptures as the holy and inspired text, and what impact this has on our interpretation. In which sense it is and it can be prescriptive, and in which sense it cannot. This is another important question which takes place within the process of the retreat. Is every word and every letter inspired and thus is to be obeyed literally? No. But when we say no, it doesn't mean that it makes the interpretation of the difficult passages much easier. We cannot simply cross them out. We need to wrestle with them. And we need to wrestle also with the history of their interpretation. And here I think the critical reading of St. Ignatius's time helped him. Critical reading of our time can help us. For example, here we really need to take on board what has been talked about before, the anti-Judaism both in the scriptures and in the history of the reception of the scriptures. The all anti-colonial, androcentric, patriarchal, homophobic, I mean, name the antis, in the scriptures and its interpretation, which are present there. This is still relevant and vitally important in the spiritual interpretation. And I would say why it is important and where it has its place. Another question, to what degree can secular theories of interpretation help in understanding scriptures? Indeed, they do, and I put the secular into brackets because they are not only secular. They are not people who would be without faith, whom we would be implementing. If we speak, for example, about Schleiermacher or about Ricoeur, they were practicing Christians, struggling to make sense of their faith as well. In which sense it speaks from a living experience to a living experience, and what are the limits of what can pass into the holy and inspired text. These are some of the questions which already the Jewish biblical exegetes were dealing with. I have now here a couple of pictures because you are tired, but also because they are important for the themes. And here I would draw more on the Orthodox theological reflection, which I think is relevant also for the Ignatian practice. Just a couple of comments on what type of tradition of spiritual interpretation we are drawing here on. Here you have Alexandria Library, and Alexandria was a place where the Hebrew Bible was translated into Greek, where Septuagint comes from, where Philo of Alexandria was active, and where he already started with the allegorical interpretation of the scriptures. Allegory meaning that there is a different meaning in the depth of the text than is on the public surface. And what is, I think, of importance that when the Christian catechetical school in the 2nd and the 3rd century took this method over and included some other methods of the spiritual interpretation. At the same time, these were the church fathers who struggled against Gnostic interpretation, that there would be just some sort of secret scriptural knowledge available only to some. The spiritual interpretation should not do that. For them, it was Christocentric interpretation. And through that, with that light, they tried to appropriate and interpret the Old Testament also as their scriptures, if not only their scriptures. Another emphasis was that the divine revelation was expressed in the symbolic language, serving all the different people to participate in what is revealed. So you would have here a very inclusive interpretation in which the discernment played a central role. Inclusive for all the different people, not only just for the illuminated some, but not inclusive for all the different heresies and the wrong understandings. What we now call discernment would be of importance. From the Alexandrian tradition, we can take not only allegorical interpretation, but also typological interpretation. They used both, and they helped them. These were some of the tools how they helped them to move beyond what they call the physical meaning of the scriptures, historia. While they never said that historia is unimportant, but that this is not all that there is to the scriptures. The physical meaning helped in teaching people literally how to conduct their lives. But not all of the texts had their meaning, that meaning according to them. Then there was the mental and the spiritual level of the meaning. The mental addressing the situation of the human soul, its cares and fears and expectations in the world. The spiritual meaning or theoria, a contemplation of the depths of the divine mystery. When we look at St. John Cassian, who became the dominant influence on later ascetic tradition and had a decisive influence on the medieval interpretation, we have already 4 levels of meaning of the scriptures. Apart from the direct, the allegorical, and the moral, it included also anagogic, being lifted to the mysteries of the end of the times. Although St. Ignatius never directly comments on that theoretically, this is not what he wrote or what he did. You can see that in some of the meditations, like when he offers how people can make distance to what is happening right now in their lives. He says, well, look at what is happening from the point of view of your death. When you are dying and getting ready to meeting your creator face to face, how would you have liked that your decision about this matter would look like? So here we can see the anagogic interpretation in practice. When we come to the spiritual interpretation of the scriptures in Ignatian spirituality, we can see again that the text is not here simply to be interrogated. Rather, it is approached in such a way that it opens a conversation with God within us. St. Ignatius says that it doesn't nourishes the soul when people know a lot, but when they experience the reality inwardly. You know that he paid quite a lot of attention to education, and knowing was not definitely something negative for him, but this was not enough. And when we think about critical reading in that context, I think it is partly present when he chooses the passages for the retreats. It's not accidental. Then the text testifies, but not limit the divine mysteries. This is another critical insight. The text is not everything. It is help, holy help, sacred help, inspired help. The scriptures offer a critical reading of our own lives, another implementation of the critical. It invites to a conversion, to a contemplative depth to our lives, and to the participation in the divine mission, renewing the life of the humankind. And again, you have the ever-present multi-layered discernment. Then, when the retreats take place nowadays, one of the emphasis which you also find in St. Ignatius is the emphasis on the silence. The retreats, they usually take place in silence. People speak only when they pray or when there is some real need or when they speak to the spiritual director. Otherwise, the silence enables that the deeper processes take place. And the silence initiates also conversation with God, with the help of the scriptures, with my imagination, my life, and my context, and with the spiritual director. I use here the word director, and it doesn't mean that this is a spiritual boss, as I said before already, but it is somebody who helps to give directions when somebody is lost. And as such role is really important. What kind of conversation? Not only we read the scriptures, but also scriptures read our life. The conversation has begun before the text and leads beyond the text. And another important emphasis is the active role of vices and virtues in the journey towards freedom, towards generosity, towards God, and solidarity with others. This is something which is taken from the ascetic tradition, from the patristic tradition. And I think in my experience during the retreats, although people may not use the language vice and virtue, but I think the powers which are actively present in their lives or the repetitive patterns of their behavior, both positive and negative, they play really important part. And working with them is so fragile and so important that it helps to go back always to the what St. Ignatius called the charitative principle, that is to interpret the intentions of the others in the best possible light. And if what they say cannot be interpreted charitably or in that light, to try to seek with all one's power to find the best interpretation for the other one that is possible. I could go on for a long time, but perhaps I will conclude here because this can give you, I think, some hints on what the spiritual interpretation can mean today in that context. That it is not an escapism from the critical understanding, from the rational reflection, but as Justin Martyr used to say, people are born both rational and contemplative. So it is recovery of what has been underdimensioned for a long time. Thank you very much for your attention.